Welcome to the Pacenotes, a podcast about all things Porsche. And today we're going to talk about the history of Porsche Induction systems. I'm Matt, the owner of Makellos Classics.
I'm Greg Bartley, project manager.
So to start us off, we're going to talk about the early generation of the 911, 64, 65. Porsche started using the Solex carburetors, which they had used on the previous 356s, correct?
Correct. Yeah, they used the Solex 40 P1s.
Okay. And those Porsche used until about 66.
Yeah.
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 So what were the specs on that? Why did they decide to use that?
Well, it was like a spill tube carburetor. So, you're looking back on the very earliest 356s, and they had that single barrel Solex carb. Late 50s, they moved over to Zeniths. They moved over to a dual barrel carb, and 550 Spiders got a different body, and they got a little more robust carbureted system. But by the time the 911 came out, they had the Solex P1, and it was basically like six separate carburetors shared a single manifold.
Individual, correct?
Yeah. And you had the recirculating fuel pump that was adding to delivery. Okay. So it was definitely a more effective system than the earlier 356 models.
And then they used that until halfway through 66, I believe, right?
Right.
And then they went to the Webers. And those were just the Weber 40 ID. What were the ID?
So they used the whole IDA family. So, that changed with some of the more flagship cars, the 911S. You moved on to 911Ls, that weird, 1 year only American 1968 model. And then IDA or
Which
IDTPs.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that the L had a different. I mean, it wasn't that big of a difference, but I didn't know they had a different carburetor on the Ls.
Yeah, I mean, while they all look the same, they're very different when it comes to calibration, acceleration ports, progression ports. So rather than just changing components on the carburetors themselves, they just obviously had different models.
Because from what I know about the L, I thought it was basically the base model 911 that they put all the S trim on, and they basically because they couldn't bring the S to the States in '68, right?
Right, it was like their detuned S.
So, but they did have a separate carburetor for that, I guess. Okay, cool.
And then also with the 912s, the 912s came out in '65, and those used a more advanced version of that
356 Solex.
Yeah, it was the 40 P24 if I remember right. So it was a split shaft carburetor that they used. That one actually came out in '67. Early on, they used the Solex, the 40 P2, which they used on the Super 90 and the SCs from the 356s.
Okay.
That was early on, and they switched over in '67 to that split shaft.
67 split shaft. Sorry, I got distracted. Okay, and so moving on to the, what would that be? So they changed from the Solexes in halfway through 66, right? So they moved to the Weber carburetors,
Correct.
Which we just talked about. Those went on till 69, was the last year of the Weber, and those were the IDTPs.
Yeah, the IDTPs, the last generation.
Okay, and was there anything different between the IDAs and the IDTPs?
Mostly it was just calibration and the acceleration and progression ports. So again, rather than having to have a bunch of, they don't want to put together the carbs themselves at the factory. They just want to take off the shelf and put it in. So they had different models between the two.
Cool. And then from the Webers, Porsche decided to move to Zeniths in 1970.
Right, and that was the Zenith 40 TIN for the 10s.
And there's mixed kind of thoughts on those.
Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of people say, well, Webers are more expensive. Zeniths had a little bit more pollution control features on them, so that's why those started being released in the U.S. market. But a lot of people, like engineers and even techs, say it's a better carburetor. It was just part availability was terrible.
You can't modify them really.
Not a lot of
that's why you see a lot of the hot rod 911s. They'll have the Webers on them. If not, they'll go up to the PMOs or whatever.
Right.
But you do see. I mean, just this car right behind us, this 1971, has Weber 40 IDAs on it.
Right.
And came with Zenith. It's a 71.
Right. Yeah.
But it was an upgrade to go up to Webers.
Yeah, and just again hard to find the parts, and people just know Webers. Webers, you can replace literally every part on those cars.
Yeah. And Mark here, Mark, our technician here, he loves the Zeniths, but again, he knows you just can't really modify it too much.
Right.
You can't really do too much with them.
And a lot of people really love the early Solexes too. They were floatless, so it was a cool design. But again, you just saw Webers on so many other cars. It was just a very gold standard.
You don't really want to upgrade to the Solexes
Right.
with the price these days.
Well, yeah, people were throwing them away, which is why they've gotten so expensive at this point.
But
I mean, that pretty much covers carburation.
yeah, and
through the long
Zeniths,
goods.
well, also in 7071, which were Zeniths for the T's, not the E's and the S's. The E's and the S's, they had the MFI, which
Right.
started with, they just started 69, didn't it?
69, yeah.
And from 69 to 71, they had the magnesium stacks, right? Magnesium stack MFI system. And that was more of a pulse system, but
Yeah, so mechanical fuel injections, it's pretty interesting because it functions similar to modern electronic systems, and that it would kind of control the mixture of air and fuel and provide that fuel to each cylinder that needed it, versus some of the later systems that just gave you all fuel all the time. And so the MFI system actually came out in '66 on not in production use, but on the race cars in the 906, and then later you saw them on the 911R.
and that's actually one of, everyone sees MFI. I remember when we were first getting into this, the MFI was just everyone loves it. Everyone loves MFI. It sounds great. When it's performing, it's great. Adjusting, it's a pain in the butt.
Right.
But when it's performing well, it's
Once you get it
a really
running,
awesome system.
it's very complicated to work on.
Yeah.
Not so much from tuning, but if you have a seized piston, there's probably half a dozen people in the country that you send these pumps out to.
I love the way MFI looks as well. I think it's a great looking system, and I think carbs are as well. And what we'll talk about next is the CIS system. I don't like that look as much. It's just it kind of goes down in the looks category, but as far as efficiency and all that. But yeah, the MFI system is definitely a really cool system in performance. It's really a nice system when it's set up correctly. And so MFI was introduced in '69 to '71, but then in '72, all of the cars changed to MFI. So it was
All the U.S. cars.
All the U.S.
So,
cars.
yeah, they came out with, you had your 69, 911Ss. When the E's came out, the E model, obviously the E stood for mechanical fuel injection. I won't try and pronounce the German word for that, but
Einspringer or something like that.
and then, in 72, our emission standards were quite a bit different than that of the rest of the world. 72 and basically 72 T's came with MFI, which was nice, while the rest of the world was still carbureted.
So really, the U.S. was the first one to get the MFI system for the T's.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the first kind of like upgrade that we.
Oh yeah, we got all the hand-me-downs.
Usually, and I guess they were testing out on us, but
Right.
I mean, they already tested it, so.
Yeah.
But
And then-
and then they went to plastic stacks in '72.
Right. Yeah. Save money plus magnesium has a tendency to crack, and it's great for race applications, but the longevity just wasn't there.
Yeah, and so and then I think mechanical fuel injection is famous for the RS and the RSR and I guess the 906 as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of famous race cars, production cars that are known for the MFI system, and
Right.
I think
For your home mechanic, though, good luck. Even our guys don't try to attempt to work on those pumps. There's a special set of tools, jigs, and then even trying to find the parts. I guess
and once you send them out, you got 3 months to get them back, and it's not cheap.
you're waiting 3 months, they're a couple grand, and it's an expensive system, but it's really cool.
But so the
Most places.
MFI, the T, E, and S, the pump was different for each one.
So yeah, there are 6 spec sheets for the different MFI pumps, depending on whether it was a 2-liter, a 2.2, a 2.4, and then the different packages, whether it was a T, E, S, and then there's actually the last one is for the 73 RS.
Okay.
At least for the production cars, in the workshop manuals. Obviously, there's going to be a sheet for the 906 and the 911R, but
the RSR. And all
we
that.
don't really, see those in our shop
You
manuals.
don't get those?
No, it's
They didn't
weird.
come in there?
You don't get a lot of those cars.
Yeah. So moving on, the the next system that, there's another debate. Do people like it or do they like it less than the MFI, which the MFI it's a hard thing to live up to, which is an awesome system. Performance-wise, it was great. But they moved in 73 and a half, they came out with the CIS, K-Jetronic Bosch system, correct? Which they're coming out with for efficiency and also I think regulations for the U.S., right?
Yeah, as emission standards got a little more strict. Plus, it's just obviously a simpler system to work on.
Those things you can just plug it in and you're good to go.
Yeah. And that was, continuous injection system. CIS is the short term for it, or people call it K-Jetronic. And it was a good system. It metered the amount of fuel to be provided as a function of the air drawn in. So there's some intelligence built into it.
Well, it lasted 10 years, 73 to 83.
Yeah, up to 83. Unlike, the newer systems, the Motronics, which we'll get into later, and MFI, though, it wasn't pulse injected. So it basically treated all the injectors the same and delivered the same amount of fuel to all of them at all times.
It is the one system that you see people building hot rods, and it's the one system that's not on any hot rod.
Right. You're
building hot rod, either doing carburetors, you're doing MFI, you're doing Motronic system, you're not doing CIS.
Right.
Which, people say that, the 911 SC was probably one of the better cars Porsche made as far as
solid.
Yeah, it's a very solid car. Now people say it was underpowered.
Right.
But I guess when you're building a hot rod, you're not really building it for power.
Well, and a lot, that's the inefficiencies in that CIS system, right? I mean, as you're spraying fuel into all the manifolds at the same time, you're relying on the opening and closing of cylinder valves to regulate fuel. So, you end up, implementing and introducing, a lot more fuel where it doesn't need to be.
Which is why it's
very infamous
the
for
pop-off valves.
Exactly. You had that little flapper valve on the inside.
73, in 73 I don't know if was it the recall in 73 or was that 70 even 74?
I think it would have been in 74, maybe even tipping to 75.
They had to call these cars back because of the backfires and
the backfire and
catch on fire.
That CIS airbox would be all melted.
Yeah, I've seen cars that it's happened to, and they're like, "Oh, the back of the car was painted white. It caught on fire."
Yeah, exactly. And you're throwing fuel into a closed valve. I mean, where is it going to go? And that's why it was also, early on, it was an open loop system. So it didn't monitor output gases, right? So you didn't know whether your air fuel mixtures are at the right level. But then in 80, again, as they started going further into emissions, that's when they started introducing oxygen sensors. So you could actually see, okay, well, am I truly running rich? Am I running lean? And you have an actual way to be able to measure that.
That was with the Motronics.
That was actually later into the CIS. Yeah, starting in 1980.
All right.
Yeah, that's when O2 sensors started.
Well, and that's kind of that also year of when I'm looking at SCs. Some people like a few things about the earlier SCs, but you look at the SCs, and I think that the 80 and up are kind of the better cars because they took off the, all the extra, what is it, the emission stuff. So they took off all the thermal reactors. Well, the thermal reactors were up to 77, I think.
Right. There's a little spillover into 78, but yeah, that was when they were trying to get the engines as hot as possible to burn off all those, the carbons and all the extra gases they didn't want. And weirdly enough, engines started popping.
Wow.
Excess heat, imagine.
Also on a magnesium case.
Right.
That's another plus.
Yeah, they like that.
But yeah, so and then the CIS ended in 83.
Yep.
And they went to the Motronic.
That's when they moved over to Motronic, which it was just a huge leap, right? I mean, anytime you start marrying the fuel delivery system and air induction together, because they both rely on each other to hit that ideal stoichiometric air fuel ratio, which if you talk to the techs, they can tell you right off the top of their head is 14.6 to 1, which they'll call lambda. And so that's that number that you're always trying to hit for when you're tuning these cars. But having that first Motronic system is very primitive. What we look in on modern cars, we've got, dozens and dozens of sensors that had, maybe 5 or 6. You had an RPM sensor to see how fast the engine was actually running. Airflow, which, obviously is an important one. Tells you what the load on the engine is. The oxygen sensor, what they implemented in 80, but still continued on through the Motronic systems. And then timing and cylinder head sensors. So, they could see all the different, all the major players in the motor at that point and see how they're playing so they could really tune these things up. So that's where you saw a fairly progressive bump from the SCs up into the Motronic units, I say Motronic units, but basically the Carreras, 84 to 89.
Those are great cars.
Fantastic. Yeah, when you tie in those two together, not only does it know the meters of fuel and knows which cylinder to send it to, but it also knows when to fire the spark. And that's a big piece in coupling the ignition system, fuel systems, and air delivery.
Before it was just a guessing game.
Yeah, you're just reliant on a lot of, you're less reliant on computer-aided systems and more into, old school mechanical techniques.
So. And
then, we further progress after 89, or starting in 89, the 964. And
which was still a Motronic system, but it was...
Still Motronic, but they really upped the game, and they went to a 55-pin DME, which, pins don't always correlate to better, but in this sense, it's just that many more sensors. And so it was, it's Motronic on steroids. Right? So it's a fully sequential injection system. A faster processor, so that the Motronic unit's working faster, but the biggest thing is that's when the bidirectional communication came out. So it's what they before Pee-wees, it was the Bosch Hammer, is what they called it. That was the diagnostic laptop, and that's where they're able to come in and actually pull codes. Right, so this is OBD1 territory.
Yeah. So.
Even Motronic and below, you turn your car off, you don't know what happened that last session,
This is the beginning of being able to see what's going wrong with your car.
Yeah, you actually, and they were, at that point, OBD1 was not standardized, so it was still manufacturer-specific codes. So that's when the codes were DTCs, or diagnostic trouble codes, I believe, instead of now you're used to seeing P codes, P401 or something like that.
What's P stand for?
Problem? Porsche?
Porsche problems?
Pay attention to me.
So in the 964, they went to, they still had the Motronic system. And now the injection itself, or the induction, what was the big difference between the 3.2 and the 3.6?
At that point, it was a fully sequential fuel injection system. So it was able to, along with all the additional sensors, able to really quickly identify where the fuel delivery needed to go, and how much, and how much, again, with the add-on of the sensors that were brought in the Carreras, airflow sensors, things like that, you're able to identify how much air is coming in, how much fuel needs to go in, what cylinder, and do that much faster. So it was much more of an intelligent system. Plus, some of those sensors got upgraded from some of the dumber sensors that they added early on. You look at the engine temperature sensor. This was always a common issue with earlier cars. They were a one-wire sensor, so it was had potential on it, which means it was grounded through the threads. But if the threads got corroded, then the sensor wouldn't work correctly.
It's amazing with the big step they made with from the regular Carreras to the 964s that they didn't have all those they did have electrical problems, but they didn't have as many as you hear some cars. They might have got the kinks out with the 928s.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because those things had all kinds of problems.
Absolutely.
They made a pretty big step between even the CAS, the Motronic in '84, and then from the Carreras to the 964s.
Yeah.
That's a big jump to make without a ton of issues, and that's.
The 964s. I think when it came out, they were saying it was 85% different than the Carreras. Carreras is, in my mind, it's the last of that analog, even though it wasn't analog. Last of the analog 911s.
Well, you can still, interchange a lot of parts from, these early long hoods to the Carreras.
absolutely.
Underneath the car looks very similar. Whereas the 964, it's complete. They definitely redesigned the whole thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Going back to that, just the amount of upgrades that they were able to throw into that car, like you said, with minimal issues or minimal, backfires, pun intended. One of the other sensors that they upgraded was the oxygen sensor. So they introduced it in 1980 and continue on through the Carreras. But in 964, they made it plunge proof basically. So you go through a dip and the thing gets completely covered in water or is actually underwater, it still functions. So that was a very common issue with early oxygen sensors, is that they'd get wet and nope, too bad.
Not working anymore.
Yeah.
So
964, when you talk about air delivery, this was a big piece, is that they added a resonance flap. The Motronic era, 84 to 89 on the Carreras, that's when they introduced that resonant intake manifold. But it didn't have any. It was always the same dimensions, same basically area. With that resonance flap, they were actually able to change the cross-sectional area of that intake manifold based on driving conditions, RPM, and you could do what they call resonance tuning, which air is moving around in all sorts of crazy directions, and they call them pressure oscillations. So you can actually tune your intake based on those oscillations with that resonance flap, which you couldn't do on the
the resonance flap was the one that it allows more air or less air based off of whether you're going slower or faster.
Right. It basically changes what the internal dimensions of that intake plenum.
And so, moving on to the next system in the 993s, are you?
Well, there's a couple of things in the 964. NOx sensors, that was a huge one, and then it was also twin plug, which that's a big step. And
from these cars.
From an ignition standpoint, that was big, because then you could start getting, as the quality of our gas started getting
crappier and crappier.
Basically, we can get a proper spark on both sides, which is nice.
Okay.
And you saw that on the early race cars too, 911R, I'm sure 906 and 904.
Yeah, it was always a thing. It was just they never standardized on the car until 964.
Right.
It was a lot of different things made them do
Right.
that, but it's probably a lot more expensive for them to do that.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
They saw it necessary at that point.
And most of your hot rods are going to be running twin plug too, just so you can run those higher compression ratios. You start getting into the high nines, definitely into the tens, but the high nines with a single plug and standard pump gas gets a little sketchy. So if you're in Europe and you're getting nice 98 octane, that's wonderful. But we're lucky to get like quality 91 octane here. So
Ours is pretty big, especially in California.
yeah, I try and twin plug wherever I can. So that's what makes 964 is really nice too.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there was 964s were a big step, you can tell just by looking at the engine on a 964 compared to Carrera.
Yeah.
An 80s Carrera, because there's just so much more in there.
Looks totally different.
So, and then the next step was the 993.
Yeah.
And 95 was the same exact system.
Yeah.
So that was the very first year.
All the big changes started in 96.
And the 96 was the Vari-O-Ram, which was also a great system. The only the one big thing with that came, the valve started building up carbon with the Vari-O-Ram, and that's why you see a lot of these 993s with 60,000 miles. Every 60,000 miles, you're doing a valve job.
You're doing, yeah.
And I think performance-wise, it's better, but you will get those customers in here sometimes that want the 95 just because they don't have to really deal with that.
Yeah, you're seeing more valve jobs. We get a lot of reseals in here, a lot of leaky chain boxes. Like there's a lot of things that once you start getting in the 993 territory.
Well, it's also a pretty big jump in power and all that kind of stuff
Yeah.
for these cars as well. It was the first time they were actually putting out 220 to the wheels.
That's when obviously that's why the 996 came out, is they kind of reached that pinnacle when it came to air cooleds, at least for the technology at that time.
Yeah, they couldn't really do much more than the 993
Right.
with an air cooled car.
I mean, now you're seeing 4-liter 4.4 air cooled engines running around, but we've got a lot more technology. behind it to be able to properly manage those systems.
Also, those systems are definitely, they're not going to pass any smog.
No, not going to pass smog, and you're not going to see them in a production car. But that Vari-RAM system, why people liked it is it kind of added on to that resonance flap concept on the 964, where it would effectively change the length of the intake ducting based on the engine load and speed. So, in a low RPM range, you want a longer intake length, and that's going to give you more low-end torque. But then when you're up in the high RPM range, you want to shorten that length, and that gives you, that's going to give you more mid-range torque. So it was a really clever system. And again, like you said, there's pros and cons to it, because that also added.
It's because pros and cons to all of it. A lot of it is they were fighting with emissions the whole time. It's like, how do we make this thing? Because they had to look at the next step. How's the car going to be better? But then also they've got more regulations now, so we also have to make it pass emissions, and that's tough to do. So, with what they had to work with, they definitely did pretty well. I like the Vari-RAM look; is a great look too. The 964s had the plastic. What do they call manifolds?
Yeah, they went from those cast manifolds. 89, I think it was still cast, so it shared the same manifold as the Carrera. Then they went to plastic, which, when you think from an airflow and impedance perspective, it's smoother, it's air, and you still see them being used on hot rods. A lot of systems are using that 964 plenum. Then you see GT3 plenums being added from the 996.
Why not?
Yeah, of course. And the biggest, well, I'd say the biggest, but from a DME or an electronic monitoring standpoint, OBD2 came out in the 993s. So that's when you started to get standardized fault code. So it wasn't just, we used Porsche's fault code, which is for emissions, which is totally different than Chevy's. It was, you get a P308 that's consistent across the board with all manufacturers. So that's when they started, moving over into the PUE system, moved away from the Bosch hammer, and it was, it was a really good time for cars. You're actually able to plug in and see what's happening, versus just having to play a guessing game or taking a screwdriver and putting it up on the motor to try and hear
to
things.
Listen what's wrong.
Yeah, it's definitely a leap.
And then you got giant leap till today where they can just see everything that's wrong with the car.
Oh yeah, now they can actually actuate and turn on systems through the laptops and really run a holistic test of the entire system.
And for people building hot rods, you got the Motronic systems and all those aftermarket things that are, there's some great systems out there.
Absolutely, yeah. You see Motec M94 is a very common upgrade. Cluid Engineering likes to use Electromotive. And it's, the difference, they're all basically doing the same kind of thing. It's just how many sensors can you throw into different places and how much data can you get. And, you go from the earliest, 84 Motronic unit where you get, half a dozen sensors to, the Motec-based race cars where they've got sensors everywhere you could possibly think of. More data they can ever have, but you're trying to tune to the nth degree. There's a lot of options out there. And then, some people just don't want to deal with laptops, and, you just throw your Weber carbs on there. Not the most efficient, but not the most complicated either.
CIS is probably the easiest one in that case.
Yeah, there's something, I love carbs. I love just having that raspy, poppy noise.
So does MFI. MFI is a really good sound.
I can't work on MFI, so it scares me.
The MFIs can be a pain in the
carbs, and that's where CIS was a great benefit is, carbs, if you didn't start the car every day, a good chance in trying to get to Cars and Coffee after a month, because it probably won't start out.
Oh yeah,
you're adjusting
cars sit for a couple of weeks and you're having to blow out the jets and all that kind of stuff.
They like to get gummed up.
But when you're running them and they're, you've got, you've constantly got fuel going through them. They're great. They're fun.
A lot of people
that's another thing with like carbs, and I think the MFI system had it as well, the elevation change.
Right. Yeah, you saw that on MFI had a clever little system where they had that atmospheric compensator, which had a little diaphragm on the inside that basically changed delivery based on where you're at atmospherically.
You take carburetors up to the mountains and you're popping everywhere.
Yeah.
And you probably might not even get home. But
yeah, exactly.
So
You have to have a set of carbs for the mountain and a set of carbs for down back home. I mean, a lot of people ask us, what's the best, not only in those words, the best induction system, but what should I have in my car? Should I go to carbs? Should I get a CIS car?
that's all that's
It's all based on your driving and what kind of maintenance you want. I mean, as inefficient from a performance standpoint as CIS is in my mind, it's just it's rock solid when it's working. And I usually steer people if they have never driven Porsche.
If you go on long drives for a long period of time, go with CIS.
Go get
the Motronic,
the newest SC you can at that point. When people they're shopping for 964s and 993s, and they don't know whether they want one or the other, and
it's preference.
Yeah, it really is.
It's not that big. I mean, they're two completely different cars, but at the same time, it's really at that point. I don't know. Some people like the 964s and the 95, 993 because they don't have to deal with that carbon issue and build up in the valves. But the 993, it's a newer car and it's got more updates and it's probably a little more comfortable. So it's all preference really when it comes down to all that. As far as performance-wise, obviously the best thing you could probably do is go an EFI or Motec and whatever.
Yeah, go get some of the newer technologies and go with a modern electronic fuel injection, get independent throttle bodies, throw in an aftermarket ECU, and you can really just dial these motors in. So that's a quick overview on. Yeah,
that's the bulk of basically induction systems for Porsche.
Right. At least air-cooled motors. Things changed after 996, but that's
we won't get into that. That can be a later one. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them under. Give us a call. We'd love to help you out in any way. Thank you for joining.